3 bearings, 51 missiles, 1 carrier. The geometry had been the product of 6 weeks of planning by an IRGC Aerospace Force targeting cell that had studied every available record of U.S. Navy carrier strike group air defense engagements and arrived at a conclusion that was mathematically precise and operationally audacious. A simultaneous, multi-axis cruise missile attack delivered from 3 divergent bearings, separated by angles greater than 90 degrees, would force the Aegis engagement network to manage 3 independent threat sectors simultaneously, splitting its intercept capacity, exhausting its assignment logic, and creating the geometric conditions under which no single engagement chain could cover the full threat picture without accepting unacceptable gaps in at least one sector. The targeting cell had called it Operation Sehgane, Persian for 3 angles. The planning had begun on March 3rd, 5 days after the February 28th strikes had removed Iran's fixed launch infrastructure and forced its missile forces into a dispersal posture that the targeting cell had, in the weeks since, converted from a defensive necessity into an offensive geometry. The dispersal was not merely survival. It was the raw material of the 3-axis attack. Launchers scattered across 3 separate geographic corridors: the Bushehr coastal zone to the north, the Hormozgan mountain belt to the east, and a 3rd axis that the planners had spent the most time constructing. A western vector originating from mobile launcher positions that had been moved over 11 days of careful night movement into the Khuzestan lowlands near the Iraqi border, a location from which the approach vector to USS Theodore Roosevelt's operating area in the northern Arabian Sea was geometrically separated from both coastal axes by angles of 127 and 143 degrees respectively. 127 degrees and 143 degrees. Those 2 numbers were the operational heart of the entire plan. An Aegis engagement network defending against threats from 3 bearings separated by those angles cannot, under any conditions, commit its full intercept capacity against any single axis without accepting exposure on the other 2. The network's engagement geometry has physical limits. SM-2 and SM-6 missiles have turn rates, fuel constraints, and engagement envelopes that are fixed by physics. A threat arriving from 127 degrees away from the threat the intercept weapon was assigned to cannot be reached by the same weapon. The targeting cell had done the mathematics. The mathematics said 51 missiles, 3 axes, simultaneous arrival window of 90 seconds, and the Aegis network on a standard carrier strike group configuration would produce a gap. The mathematics said the gap would be on the eastern axis, where the mountain belt geometry constrained the radar's low-altitude coverage, and where the Hormozgan launchers had been positioned to exploit exactly that constraint. The mathematics were correct. What the targeting cell had not factored into its model was the USS Shiloh. At 3:44 a.m. on March 24, 2026, the strike group commander aboard USS Theodore Roosevelt received an intelligence summary from the National Reconnaissance Office's real-time support cell that had been tracking the Khuzestan launcher movement for 9 days. The summary was the product of the most sustained overhead collection effort that the NRO had conducted against a single Iranian operational development since the conflict began. 9 days of satellite passes, synthetic aperture radar imaging, and persistent low observable ISR coverage that had built a picture of 21 mobile launcher vehicles executing what appeared, for the first several days, to be routine dispersal relocation. It had not looked like a 3-axis attack until the 8th day, when the NRO's pattern-of-life analysis detected that the Khuzestan launcher positions were converging on coordinates that, when entered into a standard launch geometry calculator alongside the known positions of the Bushehr and Hormozgan launchers, produced a simultaneous time-on-target window against a carrier operating at the Roosevelt's current position in the northern Arabian Sea. 3 axes, simultaneous arrival. The NRO analyst who had recognized the geometry had recognized it at 3:17 a.m. and had transmitted the summary to 5th Fleet Command and the Roosevelt's embarked intelligence cell simultaneously. She had included, in the summary's final paragraph, a single sentence that the strike group commander read at 3:44 a.m. and read again. The described geometry represents a deliberate attempt to saturate the strike group's multi-axis engagement capacity and cannot be defended against by standard carrier strike group defensive posture without supplemental Aegis platform positioning on the eastern axis. The eastern axis. The mountain belt geometry. The gap the targeting cell had built its plan around. At 3:47 a.m., the strike group commander made a call to USS Shiloh. USS Shiloh was a Ticonderoga-class cruiser that had been operating as the strike group's primary Aegis BMD platform, positioned 31 nautical miles northwest of the carrier on its standard BMD support axis. The call directed Shiloh to execute an emergency repositioning to a new coordinate that the strike group's operations team had computed in 3 minutes. A position 67 nautical miles east-southeast of the carrier that placed Shiloh's SPY-1A radar in direct line of sight to the Hormozgan Mountain Belt's low-altitude approach corridor, covering precisely the engagement gap that the NRO analysis had identified. Shiloh's commanding officer had the repositioning order at 3:48 a.m. He had the ship at flank speed at 3:49 a.m. The repositioning would take 47 minutes at maximum sustainable speed. The Iranian launch sequence began at 4:19 a.m. Not from one location, from all 3 simultaneously as the plan required, with a timing precision that reflected the operational discipline of a force that had been preparing this specific execution for 22 days and had rehearsed the communications and timing protocols until the launch window was achievable across all 3 geographically separated battery positions within a 38-second coordination margin. The S-Bors satellite detected the Bush Air launches first. 17 missiles, their thermal plumes rising from 9 separate launcher positions along the coast. At 4:19:07 a.m., the Hormozgan launches were detected at 4:19:22 a.m. 16 missiles from the Mountain Belt corridor. Their boost phase signatures visible against the eastern horizon even before the radar network had resolved individual tracks. The Khuzestan launches were detected at 4:19:41 a.m. 18 missiles from the western lowland positions, their approach vectors unfolding across a bearing that the strike group's sensors were covering, but that had, until 7 minutes ago, not been the primary focus of the defensive posture. 51 missiles, 3 axes, the simultaneous arrival window that the targeting cell had computed. 4:32 a.m. to 4:33 a.m. A 90-second window during which all 3 raid packages would be in their terminal phases simultaneously, forcing the Aegis network to manage intercepts across 3 independent sectors at the same moment. At 4:19:44 a.m., 3 seconds after the last launch was detected, USS Theodore Roosevelt's Combat Information Center produced the track picture that every Aegis operator present would later describe in identical terms. It was the most complex air threat display any of them had seen outside of the highest-tier simulation environments. And the simulation environments had not prepared them for the physical reality of watching 51 track symbols populate a display in 37 seconds. Their projected intercept timelines overlapping and competing and demanding simultaneous decisions from a system and a human team that had been trained for exactly this and was now discovering the difference between training for it and living inside it. The Cooperative Engagement Capability Network linking Shiloh, USS Mobile Bay, USS Lake Erie, and USS Bunker Hill to Roosevelt's combat system had been active since 3:51 a.m., when the strike group commander had elevated the formation to Condition 1 following the NRO summary. The network's engagement assignment logic began computing track assignments at 4:19:44 a.m. By 4:20:11 a.m., 27 seconds after the last launch detection, The network had produced its first complete engagement plan. Weapon assignments across all 4 Aegis platforms, deconflicted and optimized against the 3-axis threat geometry, with the computational efficiency that no human team could have matched in 27 seconds. The first SM-2 left USS Bunker Hill at 4:20:19 a.m., assigned to the lead element of the Bush-Air Northern Raid. The first SM-6 left USS Lake Erie at 4:20:24 a.m., assigned to a high-priority Hormozgan track that the engagement logic had flagged as the most likely penetrator candidate in the Eastern Raid based on its approach vector and altitude profile. The first SM-2 from USS Mobile Bay launched at 4:20:31 a.m. against the leading element of the Khuzestan Western Raid. 3 ships, 3 axes, 3 separate engagement chains running simultaneously, coordinated by a network that was doing what it had been built to do. USS Shiloh was still repositioning. At 4:20 a.m., she was 34 nautical miles from her assigned position and making 31 knots. Her SPY-1A radar had acquired the Hormozgan raid at 4:19:38 a.m. Before she reached her assigned position, but close enough to the eastern axis geometry that her fire control system could build track solutions on 12 of the 16 eastern raid contacts. She began firing at 4:20:44 a.m., committing SM-2S against the eastern raid from her current position, accepting a degraded engagement geometry against the 4 contacts still behind the mountain belt's horizon mask and filing them as handoff candidates for the P-8A Poseidon that had been redirected to the eastern corridor at 3:52 a.m. The P-8A's contribution to the eastern axis engagement was not part of any pre-planned defensive architecture. It was improvised, authorized in real time by the strike group commander at 3:52 a.m., when the NRO analysis made clear that the eastern axis gap was real and that Shiloh's repositioning would not be complete before the missiles arrived. The P-8A carried 4 AGM-84 Harpoon missiles in an anti-surface configuration, weapons designed for surface targets, not for engaging cruise missiles in the air. But a cruise missile flying at low altitude is, for the purposes of an airborne radar-guided weapon, an object with a radar cross-section that can be acquired and engaged. The P-8A's weapons employment officer had never trained specifically for this configuration. He had the physics of it, and he had the aircraft's fire control system. And at 4:21:17 a.m., he fired the first Harpoon at a NOR missile variant crossing the eastern corridor at 180 meters altitude. The Harpoon's active radar seeker acquired the target at 4:21:44 a.m. The intercept occurred at 4:22:01 a.m. One of the 4 horizon-masked eastern axis contacts gone. The P-8, a weapons employment officer, fired his remaining 3 Harpoons at 4:22:19 a.m., 4:22:38 a.m., and 4:23:04 a.m. 2 additional intercepts. One missed that required a Shiloh SM-2 follow-up engagement at 4:24:11 a.m. By 4:25 a.m., 6 minutes into the engagement, the track picture had evolved from 51 active contacts to 33. 18 intercepts across 3 axes in 6 minutes against a raid package whose terminal phase arrival was still 7 minutes away. The mathematics of the remaining engagement were visible to every operator on every display in the formation. 33 missiles, 3 active engagement chains, 7 minutes to arrival. The mathematics were workable. They were not comfortable. At 4:26:14 a.m., the Khuzestan Western Raid produced the engagement's first serious complication. 4 of the 18 Western missiles, Quds 3 variants, whose guidance packages had been modified with a terminal evasion algorithm that the targeting cell had specifically developed for this operation, executed a simultaneous course change at 4:26:14 a.m., breaking from their inbound tracks by 23 degrees and descending from 60 meters to 11 meters altitude in a 9-second maneuver that forced the engagement network's Western Axis track files to update simultaneously. The track update took 2.1 seconds. In those 2.1 seconds, two SM-2s that had been assigned to two of the four maneuvering contacts flew past their computed intercept points and missed. The track update restored the assignments, and two follow-up SM-2s were committed at 4:26:19 a.m. But the four maneuvering contacts had closed by 4.7 nautical miles during the update window and were now inside the SM-2's minimum engagement range for a clean intercept geometry on the modified tracks. The tactical action officer on USS Mobile Bay recognized the geometry at 4:26:22 a.m. and shifted the four contacts to ESSM engagement. The ESSM quad packs responded with the high-rate fire that the system was designed to produce, committing 8 rounds across 4 contacts in a 6-second window at 4:26:25 a.m. 5 of the 8 reached their targets. 3 of the 4 maneuvering contacts were intercepted. The 4th cleared the ESSM engagement boundary and was now 9.3 nautical miles from USS Theodore Roosevelt at 11 meters altitude, its terminal seeker active. At 4:26:44 a.m., the carrier's own electronic countermeasures suite registered the terminal seeker's active radar emission. The EW operator's call was immediate. The tactical action officer on Mobile Bay, who had been tracking the 4th contact since the maneuver, had already committed the ship's last available ESSM round against it. The intercept would occur, if it occurred, at 4:27:11 a.m. at a range of 4.8 nautical miles from the carrier. USS Theodore Roosevelt's Phalanx, CIWS, acquired the contact at 4:26:51 a.m., 8.1 nautical miles out. Its autonomous tracking radar locked at 4:26:53 a.m. The CIWS was authorized to fire at 2.5 nautical miles. If the ESSM missed, the CIWS would have one engagement opportunity at a contact traveling at 550 knots in a sea-skimming profile at 11 meters altitude. The ESSM did not miss. The intercept occurred at 4:27:11 a.m., 4.8 nautical miles from USS Theodore Roosevelt. The warhead detonated above the wave surface. The fragmentation pattern spread across an area that the carrier's electronic sensors registered as a brief, low-amplitude pressure signature on her hull-mounted systems. Detectable, logged, and assessed as non-damaging. In the carrier's CIC, the single remaining active track on the western axis cleared the display at 4:27:11 a.m., and the air above 4.8 nautical miles of the northern Arabian Sea contained only the debris of a missile that had come closer to USS Theodore Roosevelt than any weapon in the engagement and had not been close enough. The northern and eastern raids completed their engagement sequences between 4:27 a.m. and 4:31 a.m. Every contact in the Bushehr northern raid was intercepted. 17 for 17. The most straightforward axis of the three because the coastal geometry had given Bunker Hill and Lake Erie the most favorable engagement angles. The Hormozgan Eastern Raid required the combined efforts of Shiloh, Mobile Bay, and the P-8A's improvised Harpoon employment. 13 of 16 intercepted by SM-series weapons, 3 by the P-8A's Harpoon shots, all 16 accounted for. At 4:33 a.m., the threat display across all 4 Aegis platforms showed 0 active tracks, 51 missiles launched, 51 intercepted or defeated, 0 impacts on any U.S. vessel. The 90-second simultaneous arrival window that the targeting cell had engineered, the window that was supposed to overwhelm the engagement network with simultaneous demands across 3 axes, had been covered by a repositioning that was still incomplete when the missiles arrived. A P-8A aircrew improvising a weapons employment that existed in no training manual, and a tactical action officer on USS Mobile Bay who had recognized a 4-missile maneuver in 2.1 seconds and shifted engagement modes fast enough to close a gap that had opened and almost stayed open. The inventory reports arrived at 4:41 a.m. USS Bunker Hill, SM, 2 reserve at 29%. USS Lake Erie, SM-6 reserve at 31%, SM-2 reserve at 44%. USS Mobile Bay, ESSM reserve at 17%. USS Shiloh, SM-2 reserve at 38%. The strike group had defended against the largest single Iranian cruise missile attack of the conflict. It had done so with margins that were real and documented and not comfortable. The replenishment request was transmitted at 4:42 a.m. The logistics pipeline that Fifth Fleet had been maintaining at forward-positioned readiness since March 8th would have the first USNS resupply vessel on station within 19 hours. The F/A-18E and F/A-18F strike packages that launched from Roosevelt's flight deck at 4:51 a.m. Their targeting data built from the engagement radar tracks, the SBIRS launch detection back azimuths, and the 9 days of NRO overhead imagery that had identified the Khuzestan launcher positions reached all three raid origin areas between 5:39 a.m. and 6:14 a.m. 41 of the 51 launch positions were struck. The remaining 10 had completed emergency displacement before the strike packages arrived. They were tracked by persistent ISR and struck in a second wave between 8:03 a.m. and 8:47 a.m. 47 of 51 launch positions rendered inoperable across both strike waves. At 7:22 a.m., the strike group commander submitted his operational summary to Fifth Fleet Command. The summary documented, with the flat precision that operational summaries require, what Operation Sehgane had produced. 51 missiles launched, 51 defeated, 0 impacts. 47 launcher positions eliminated, strike group combat effective pending resupply. The summary did not document the 2.1 seconds. It did not document the NRO analyst who had recognized the three-axis geometry at 3:17 a.m. and understood its implication before anyone had asked her to. It did not document the P-8 weapons employment officer who had fired a surface attack weapon at an airborne target at 4:21 a.m. because the physics worked, and because there was nothing else available for those 4 contacts, and because the training that does not cover this specific scenario cannot prevent a person who understands the physics from attempting it. Operation Sehgane's targeting cell had built a mathematically correct attack against a standard carrier strike group defensive posture. What it had built the attack against was not the posture that existed at 4:19 a.m. The posture that existed at 4:19 a.m. had been modified at 3:47 a.m. by a strike group commander who had read an NRO summary, recognized the gap, and made one phone call. The gap that had been designed to be fatal had been 47 minutes from being closed when the missiles launched. At the moment the terminal seekers went active, it was closed. 51 missiles found 51 intercepts. The geometry of Operation Sehgane was sound. The geometry of the response was better. The sea measures nothing except outcomes. 51 launched. 51 gone. The crew that held the line held it at the edge, and the edge was sufficient. And the ocean remembers only that the ship was still there when the sky cleared.